Between 1969 and 1973, 11 cave divers tragically lost their lives while exploring water-filled caves in South Australia's Mount Gambier. The deadliest of these incidents happened in May of 1973 at a flooded sinkhole called the Shaft. 8 divers entered the sinkhole, which has been notoriously described as a bottomless pit of water, and sadly, only 4 came out alive. Here's what went wrong and what was done to prevent history from repeating itself. The Shaft. Mount Gambier is the second largest city in South Australia, but with a population of only 33,000 residents, it is still over 40 times smaller than the next largest city, Adelaide, which is home to almost 1 million people. While it's clearly not a major metropolis, Mount Gambier is considered an important settlement. It's just a few miles away from the country's southern coast in a volcanic region called the Limestone Coast, which is situated along South Australia's border with Victoria. If you're from one of the southern states in the US, then you probably already know that wherever there's limestone bedrock, there's sinkholes. The Limestone Coast, and Mount Gambier in particular, are no exception to this trend. Sinkholes can be extremely fascinating, so it's no surprise that they're one of Mount Gambier's biggest tourist attractions. But they can also be deadly, especially when they become filled with water. The infamous Shaft is a flooded sinkhole, also known as a cenote. It was discovered back in 1938 by a farmer whose horse tripped on it while walking through a field called Thompson's Paddock. As word spread about the newly formed sinkhole, which measures only 3 feet across at its narrow opening, divers came from far and wide to squeeze inside and experience the natural spectacle for themselves. They quickly realized that the shaft consists of a main chamber measuring about 460 by 262 feet at its narrowest, with 2 large tunnels stemming off either side at a depth of 118 feet. People were undoubtedly curious about what was beyond the main chamber, but nobody ever dared to go inside the side tunnels until the tragic expedition in 1973. The 1973 Mount Gambier cave diving incident. On May 27, 1973, a group of 9 diving enthusiasts finished a successful dive at the shaft, traveling roughly 150 feet straight down from the small opening to a bunch of rubble referred to as the rock pile. After briefly exploring the perimeter, they surfaced with plans to return the next morning and dive even deeper into the hole. One of the group members, Joan Harper, ultimately decided not to participate in the next dive and to instead remain near the sinkhole, where she prepared food while waiting for the divers' return. The other 8 divers entered the shaft as planned and descended down to the rock pile. Their original intention was only to explore as far as a narrow, downward-sloping extension of the chamber called the Edge. With almost no visible light from the sinkhole's opening in this area, the largely unexplored section was past the point considered safe for diving at the time. Unaware that they would soon make news headlines for all the wrong reasons, 4 of the 8 divers finished their mission and safely returned back up to the surface, while others explored past the limits that the group discussed before the dive, and they did so without a guideline. What happened next was devastating. The divers got lost and became trapped. They were never seen alive again. At some point, even enough time passed for everyone who made it out of the cave to know that their friends, Gordon G. Roberts, John H. Bockerman, and siblings Stephen and Christine Millett, were long gone. The aftermath. Law enforcement had never taken on a rescue or recovery effort even remotely like this, giving them no chance but to learn the ropes as they went along. The day after the incident, authorities searched the sinkhole down to a depth of 200 feet. Their efforts were short, mainly because they were extremely unprepared for the hazards of cave diving and didn't want to risk losing any more lives to the so-called bottomless hole. After finding nothing with the first search, they tried again the next day, and again they came up empty-handed. At that point, local officials decided it was too dangerous to look any more without consulting experts. In order to extend their search any deeper into the cave while minimizing risks, they would have to undergo months of specialized training. So the effort to find the divers' remains was postponed indefinitely. The first body was discovered by chance about 8 months after the incident, when the owner of the land the sinkhole was in granted a documentary crew permission to enter the shaft. In January 1974, the crew dived down to a depth of 50 feet and lit the cave up using professional lighting equipment. They weren't looking for any of the lost divers, but they quickly found a body in a wetsuit. The spooked filmmakers immediately rushed to the surface and informed police, who removed the body the very next day. Using dental records, they eventually identified the remains of Stephen Millett. While they were inside the cave, officers searched to a depth of 180 feet, but failed to turn up any sign of the other 3 missing divers. Over the next few months, the landowners became increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that there were 3 human bodies mysteriously trapped somewhere on their property. So they took matters into their own hands and contacted a diving team to carry out a recovery mission, but this ultimately proved unnecessary. After taking deep diving lessons from Royal Australian Navy instructors, the police were finally at a point where they were almost ready to conduct a thorough search of the shaft. In March 1974, 3 months after the discovery of Stephen Millett's body and almost a year after the initial incident, a law enforcement team descended down into the sinkhole. Armed with improved diving equipment and skills, they finally spotted the remaining 3 bodies. Shortly after locating the remains of Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts at a depth of 185 feet, the team descended another 20 feet and discovered John Bockerman's body. Over the next few days, officers made several failed attempts to bring the bodies up to the surface. On their 3rd try, they recovered the remains of Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts. They made one more try at retrieving John Bockerman before being sent home for a month to recover after the straining effects of their efforts took a toll on their bodies. After going back to the shaft with yet another batch of improved equipment and additional training, they finally managed to get Bockerman's remains. Would you ever explore a sinkhole? Let us know in the comments down below. Be sure to subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Now, back to the story. Causes. At first glance, it's easy to blame this tragedy on poor decision-making and inadequate planning. It could also be said that curiosity got the best of the 4 divers, causing them to continue deeper into the cave when the rest of their group was ready to call it quits. Investigators concluded that their equipment was in good shape and that they simply ran out of oxygen after failing to find a way out of the cave. This could easily be perceived as additional evidence that the victims deliberately abandoned safety precautions and acted entirely out of recklessness. Flawed judgment certainly played a role in this incident, but to blame it entirely on that is too simple of an explanation as to what really happened, and it would be quite the stretch to accept it at face value. For one thing, the 4 survivors were unbelievably lucky to come out of the shaft alive. They came up with barely any oxygen left in their tanks and could have easily died if they spent even just another minute or 2 exploring. This alone proved that the decision half the divers made to continue on didn't demonstrate a major difference in the judgment, despite the dramatically different outcomes of the 2 groups. All 8 divers could have done multiple things differently that might have prevented the tragedy altogether, but at some point, the circumstances were beyond their control. At extreme depths, scuba divers become highly susceptible to a condition called nitrogen narcosis, which causes an alteration of consciousness. In short, when someone breathes air under pressure that's higher than the atmosphere, they become drowsy and mentally impaired. The deeper a diver goes, the worse it gets. Even at the rock pile's perimeter, which the group surpassed during their dive, the effects of nitrogen narcosis would have been significant enough to drastically affect the diver's judgment. As they ventured beyond that line, their judgment would have only deteriorated further. There are limited ways to cope with nitrogen narcosis once it sets in. The easiest way to reverse its effects is to rise to shallower water. Nitrogen narcosis is rarely an issue when it comes to open water diving, since surfacing is practically always an option. As long as an open water diver is aware of the symptoms and responds appropriately, there are often no long-term consequences. But surfacing obviously wasn't an option for the 4 divers who were trapped in the shaft. Even if they were well aware of their condition, they may have been too confused to find their way out or even too impaired to recognize that it was a good idea to surface when they still had the opportunity. It's impossible for a diver to develop a tolerance for nitrogen narcosis, no matter how experienced and trained they are. Each diver's susceptibility to the sickness is different. In other words, what one person can handle, another person may not be able to, and it has little to do with their past exposure. Although half the group survived, all 8 members were most likely affected by narcosis. But the tragedy can't be blamed completely on the condition. The whole group was guilty of shirking safety procedures even before they would have experienced impaired judgment. They failed to use a shot line that reaches the cavern floor, were not equipped with extra oxygen tanks, and were not well versed in air management strategies that would have maximized their use of available oxygen storage. The group also neglected to use safety lines and did not choose diving partners before entering the shaft. How the accident changed cave diving. Back in 1973, cave diving in Australia was still unregulated. If anything good came from the Mount Gambier incident and several other deadly diving tragedies that happened the years leading up to the Shaft Cave disaster, it was the formation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia. Immediately after the Mount Gambier incident, way before the 4 divers' bodies were recovered, South Australia's Deputy Premier appointed a committee to investigate safety precautions for scuba divers in freshwater sinkholes and underwater caves. Simply put, it wasn't necessary to find the missing bodies for officials to understand that cave diving is dangerous and that safety precautions likely played a role in the tragedy. In early 1974, the committee made several recommendations for improving safety standards for cave diving. Key among these suggestions were establishing a higher standard of safety among the recreational diving community. As part of this effort, the committee recommended creating educational materials to improve cave divers' knowledge and their awareness of the importance of safety practices. They also asked authorities to install warning signs at sinkhole and cave sites and to seal off deadly locations, including a site called Allen's Big Hole or Death Cave. In the event that these recommendations failed to stop cave diving fatalities, the committee suggested taking control through legislative measures. In other words, they encouraged the government to create legal measures to curb deaths. They suggested multiple ways this could be done successfully, including the creation of a regulatory body that would oversee cave diving, licensing requirements for instructors, and managing sites through patrol officers, and granting access permits only to qualified divers. In a rare display of politicians listening to the experts, the government took the recommendations to heart and followed through. In April 1974, officials announced that they would listen to the committee's advice, including the suggestion to create an advisory body dedicated to recreational cave diving. By then, a group of professional cave divers from throughout the state had already met and agreed to form the Cave Divers Association of Australia. They gave valuable evidence to the committee, and they were clearly the most qualified individuals to advise both the government and civilians on diving safety. With the blessing of public officials, their existence was made official, and the group went to work. Based on its name, the CDAA may sound like a simple club for cave diving enthusiasts, and that's certainly one reason it exists. But it has a much more significant purpose than simply letting people bond over a shared hobby. Since its founding, the group has helped to dramatically reduce fatalities associated with the hobby through new safety measures and regulations. The CDAA has also helped bridge gaps in trust between private landowners and recreational divers by creating a rating system that ranks the level of difficulty at dive sites. The system was divided into 3 unique levels. Category 1 consisted of open, deep-water caverns and sinkholes with minimum overhang or ceiling. Similar sites with considerable overhangs fell in the moderately more difficult Category 2, while Category 3 was reserved for the most difficult and dangerous sites. There was also an advanced Category 3, which was later renamed Category 4. These places consisted of caves that were almost entirely flooded and/or which were impossible for more than one diver to navigate at once. The system was officially implemented in 1974, not long after the CDAA was founded, and remained in effect until 1989, when it was replaced with an even more advanced training system and additional site categories that are still being used today. Thanks for watching. What's the coolest place you've ever explored? Let us know down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.